County Commissioners Board Work Session. It is 9:04 a.m. It is July 20th, 2022. This meeting is a hybrid meeting. I'm Carolina Mejia. I'm the chair of the board. Vice Chair Ty Menser joining us in the boardroom. Commissioner Gary Edwards is excused for today. County Manager Ramiro Chavez in the boardroom, as well as other county staff, public works staff. The topic for today's agenda is County Project number 63023, Country Club Road Northwest at Green Cove Creek Culvert Replacement. And if you would like to follow along, please tune in to the Thurston County YouTube channel. With that, we'll go ahead and get started. And am I handing this off straight to Scott, or are you going to do an introduction, Ramiro?
Just an introduction, Madam Chair. Thank you and good morning. Just for you to be aware, we have members of the public attending in person here in the boardroom. So I believe we have a full room this morning. And this is a follow-up to the briefing you had related to this particular project. And the staff is going to be going through some of the alternatives again, and hopefully answer some of the questions the board had at the last briefing. I did not expect you to make a decision today. This is a very complex project, obviously, and the alternatives presented to you are also complex in nature, and mainly requires a financial strategy before the board makes an informed decision. So we'll continue to have this conversation with you today, and see where it goes after this briefing. Scott?
All right, good morning. Scott Lindblom, County Engineer with Public Works. We've got several Public Works staff with us here today. Marcus Storbeck, Teresa Parsons, Trevin Taylor from Public Works. We're all part of the project team. In addition, we brought several of our consultants that have been really a key part of this. Ty Johnson from HDR, Kelvin McCall from Landau, and Jessica Seward from Sargent Engineers. As the county manager said, this is a very complex project. We wanted to make sure that we had all the right people in the room today to make sure that we provided the information that would best suit you to make informed decisions at some point. So next slide, please, Marcus. So as you recall, the Country Club Road is just off of Cooper Point, about 2.5 miles north of Capitol High School. And under Country Club Road is a 5-foot diameter culvert that was installed in the early 1970s under Country Club Road. That culvert carries Green Cove Creek. Go ahead, slide. The next slide, please. When we discussed this project with you in May of this year, the presentation really revolved around the 5-foot diameter culvert that was installed back 50 or so years ago. An inspection in late 2021 found that the culvert had started to collapse and had collapsed about 12 inches since the prior inspection in April of 2019. We were very concerned with the fairly rapid rate of that collapse, as in about a year and a half, it had collapsed that much, and by collapsing, it's crushing. It is an active state of failure. And so we looked ahead to the fall and winter of last year. We were very concerned that the culvert would continue to collapse, and the worst fear would have been a complete collapse of that culvert, either before or during the wet season. So we looked at two different options. We looked at taking a proactive approach and really emphasizing public safety, and that approach would have involved us acting quickly, putting in a slip line pipe, which we did. But the other option we did consider was taking a more wait and see approach. Let's monitor the pipe, see what would happen, see if the pipe would continue to collapse, and then just kind of hope for the best over the winter. But I want to walk through what that choice really entailed, because if we had chosen to wait and see, what was going through our mind was, in all likelihood, the pipe would collapse, or continue to collapse, certainly, and could perhaps completely collapse over the course of the winter. And what we considered was that in less than 24 hours, if that pipe had fully collapsed, that 50-foot tall road embankment would have had 50 feet of water behind it, and water would have overtopped the road. That's assuming the road embankment wouldn't completely collapse. What that would also mean is 65 homes would be without water, without power, gas, or telephone. Again, if that embankment had collapsed, we would have sent gravel, sand, debris, construction or asphalt and other debris down, scouring out Green Cove Creek for a half mile, sending sediment down into Puget Sound. Additionally, certainly a road washout or even a road flooding would have significant risk to any pedestrians or drivers that might be crossing that section of road. While gas, phone, power could be restored a bit more readily, providing water to those 65 homes would be very, very problematic. There's really no easy way to provide water service when the main section of the pipe is cut off. Thinking about that worst case, the repair would have been significantly more expensive than the $9 million of any of the options we considered. When you look at cleanup of debris for a half-mile section of the creek, and still we would end up rebuilding the road. The risks of doing nothing from our perspective were very significant. So we chose to put that emphasis on public safety. Seeing as this was late 2021, we had to work against the clock to get any work done before the seasonal winter rains came. The quickest way to ensure that we had at least some outlet for Green Cove Creek was to install a smaller pipe within that bigger 5-foot diameter pipe. Well, that's a process we call slip lining. We put in the biggest pipe we could fit in there, which is a 36-inch diameter pipe. And it's very telling that that is the biggest pipe we could fit in that pipe because it was collapsing. So we were able to do that. We were able to get the pipe even during the supply chain issues that everybody faced last year, but we were able to get that pipe and a contractor lined up, and they were successful at installing that pipe before the winter rains came. And it's important to note that when that contractor was out on site, they actually reported to us that the pipe had collapsed even further since our inspection in September. When we chose to do that work, put the pipe in, certainly putting a pipe in a stream requires in-water work, so meaning we're working in the stream as the stream continues to flow. State law requires us, anytime we work within that stream, to get a permit called a hydraulic project approval permit. So we're required, again, by state law to get that permit. A condition of that permit that we did get requires the county to remove that temporary pipe within 2 years with a fully fish passable structure. Next slide, please. So here's a series of photos that were taken in early January of this year. You may recall in late December, early January, we had a very wet period. We had snow, then we had rain on the snow, which led to some very high creek flows. And the reason I wanted to show this picture, if you can see, it might be hard to see from a long ways away, but that red circled area is a 20-foot tall cedar tree. And the storm we had in early January was not a 25-year storm, and I'll get into that in just a moment. But what's important is that red cedar tree, 20-foot tall, was inundated to the top 3 feet. So what that means is water rose 17 feet behind that road embankment, even with a 3-foot diameter culvert that was installed. Now, while that January storm event was a big event, it was not as big as a 25-year storm. What a 25-year storm is a storm that has a 4% chance of happening in any 1 year. So another example is a 100-year storm event, which people hear about sometimes. That is not a storm that happens every 100 years. It's a storm that has statistically a 1% chance of happening in any 1 year. So you could have 2 25-year storm events in the same winter, or perhaps even in the same month. So imagine if we had a 3-foot diameter pipe in there, which we do, and the water rose 17 feet, imagine if we had a bigger storm. Or imagine if we took no action and that original culvert collapsed. So imagine if the pipe wasn't there, imagine what the water would do at that point. We'd have about 24 hours before the road would overtop. So that temporary culvert we put in, we acknowledge is much smaller than was there, much smaller than we need to put in for the final fix. And it was never intended to be in place for a long time. It was never intended to, never designed to. Leaving it in place as a permanent solution poses a lot of risks to the road, to public safety, to the utilities, and even to the environment out there in Green Cove Creek. And right now, it is a barrier to fish passage, the way it stands now. Finally, our permit requires its removal. So really, at this point, doing nothing is not an option. Next slide, please. So given that, this is a good shot, again, to put things in perspective of what we're working with here. It's a 50-foot tall road embankment with a pipe at the bottom of that. It's a complex site, geologically, because we've got varying soils around there. We've got 50 feet of material. That's about 35,000 cubic yards of road embankment, or road fill that was put in back in the 70s. For perspective, again, on that, that's about 3,000 dump trucks lined up over 14 miles long, bumper to bumper. That's the amount of material that would have to come out of there. So the options we looked at are road abandonment, which really is taking out that 35,000 cubic yards, plus or minus, to restore what would be a natural stream corridor. We looked at a pedestrian bridge. The pedestrian bridge would allow pedestrians, walkers, bikers to be able to cross that canyon or that valley on a bridge. Utilities could be attached to the bottom of that bridge, and that pedestrian bridge would also be big enough and stout enough to allow fire access. So emergency vehicles, fire trucks, ambulances could access that bridge. It would not be open to pedestrian or to private vehicles. There would be a gate on either end, or bollards, or something that would yet to be figured out. But fire trucks could go through there, but again, private cars could not. So it would essentially cut off people trying to commute through that area. An open bottom culvert is really what it sounds like. It's a 50-foot wide, so again, all these would meet our fish passage requirements, but it's a significantly sized culvert that will be put in after all that material was removed. Once the culvert is in, the road embankment will be placed back on top of that, and the road would be rebuilt on top of that. And finally, we looked at a road bridge, which is very self-explanatory. It's a 2-lane bridge that would accommodate private vehicles, fire trucks, emergency access. It would be the same function as we have right now. Next slide, please. So it's a complex site with some big challenges that we're looking at. So what we tried to do is lump these considerations into 4 different categories. The environment, we looked at what impact does that have not just on fish, but on everything. What's our commitment? What's our commitment to replace what's out there currently? What's our commitment based on the risk to the community? And what's our commitment based on the permit we received? And what are the community impacts? So again, this is not just the neighborhood that lives out there, but this is the Green Cove neighborhood. It's the people that use that road. It's really far-reaching. We looked at community cost as well. We could look at this from a county lens and make a financial decision based on what's right for use of county money. But certainly we have to recognize that if we chose the road abandonment, for example, that has a significant cost in the PUD. And I'll walk through some of that in just a moment. But we tried to look at kind of a comprehensive look, give you the information on what the county cost is, and then also what the cost of the overall community is. So I'll jump into the environment consideration. We recognize that salmon is just one of the species that use that stream corridor. And the chum salmon is a very important species in that creek, but there's also other salmonid species. There's coho, steelhead, sea-run cutthroat, but there's also other wildlife and native vegetation which really shouldn't be discounted. The reason we often focus on salmon is that there are very prescriptive standards that we can meet, that we can target, and those are outlined by Fish and Wildlife. Those are the requirements for the fish passage, for example, that we have to meet. And part of those requirements that Fish and Wildlife calls out in this case is that we have to have a 50-foot wide opening for the stream to pass through. That is a requirement that we have to meet, and it's important to recognize that all 4 of the options that we looked at meet or exceed that requirement. When we look at the road abandonment, the road abandonment issue in the bridges, which is the pedestrian bridge and the 2-lane road bridge, when we look at the other impact to the creek restoration, those 3 options would remove the most material from the valley. So in a sense, you could say that that would have the most environmental restorative impacts, because most of that imported soil is being removed. The open bottom culvert, as I mentioned a moment ago, that is a big culvert that once we removed all the soil to place the culvert, we have to bring in a whole bunch of soil back in. So you're ending up with a similar road embankment, except that road embankment would just have a much, much bigger opening than what's currently there. The culvert that would have to pass through there on that open bottom culvert, is significant. It's, over 100-foot long culvert, again, 50 feet wide. And when you look at the impacts to the environment, certainly what in effect would be a long dark tunnel, it's not nearly as natural as a big open stream. I'm not a biologist, but I do understand that long dark tunnel has a different effect on fish species, and it would not have the natural native flora and fauna that we have with a ravine embankment, because it's really in effect a long tunnel. Next slide, please. So going to our commitment, certainly the permit, so if you look at just the legal side of it, the procedural side, the permit requires the county to remove that temporary pipe and fix the fish barrier by 2024. Should the county not choose to meet that permit requirement, as I mentioned a few moments ago, the road certainly is at risk. Utilities are at risk and the fish barrier would remain. Again, should the county not choose to do that, to remove the pipe, legal action could be taken by Fish and Wildlife or other interested parties. And finally, over the last several years, we've been working very hard to build our relationships with the local tribes and with Fish and Wildlife and the other permitting agencies. This would certainly have an effect on those relationships.
Scott,
Yeah.
on this, I think it will be worth changing the word choosing as opposed to not able.
Oh, sure.
Because the financial constraint is going to be an issue the board needs to address.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe is the county is not able to meet the permit requirements. Perhaps the choice the board may have may be on the financial aspect.
Certainly. Good clarification,
That's my
thank you.
clarification.
So since the county manager jumped in with a question, Madam Chair, can I ask a question on this slide?
Go ahead, sir.
Your first bullet under the second bullet there is road at risk of flooding. Is it just a road? Is there risk to the homes? I talked to some folks that live upstream from the culvert.
Mm-hmm.
Are those homes or properties at risk if we fail to change things in the next 2 years? Is there geotechnical data or some analysis we've done that says because they weren't scientists, they weren't engineers, but they were certainly concerned, and I'm just wondering if we have something that backs up that concern or not.
Great question, and that is why we brought some of our experts in to chat with you briefly. So Kelvin, maybe you could.
Yeah. Let me clear my throat. There's certainly some upstream risk.
Could you introduce yourself?
Oh, Calvin McCacken with Landau Associates. I'm a geotechnical engineer. So there's certainly risk for upstream slope instability in the, I guess you could call it the threshold event where water comes all the way up to 50 feet and then the dam blows out and it rapidly drops. And in that case, upstream slope stability, you have a rapid drawdown condition, and that can really impact slopes substantially. I haven't taken like a 50-foot water line elevation upstream and seen where that hits every property. I'm not sure if that's something that the county's done or team. So like would backyards flood, things like that. I'm not sure at that critical level. I didn't do a hydraulics analysis, but there's a slope stability risk upstream if this pool builds all the way and then blows out. And also a downstream slope instability risk if basically a dam failure.
And how about if the road embankment remains and the water comes up and then goes down?
So if the road embankment remains and the water comes up and down, but it doesn't overtop, it needs to come down pretty quickly to cause instability on the backside of the embankment. But once water goes over the road and starts to scour out and wet the backside of the embankment, it's functionally done. That's what our analysis says anyway. So if water goes over the road, you're going to lose the embankment in a short amount of time.
Calvin, can you hit on how quickly that fills up behind the upstream side culvert during the 25 and the 100 year? Because I know you ran some calculations on that.
Yeah,
Just some rough calcs.
I think that if the culvert plugs, right, so that's one thing we can't control. Will sediment build up on the upstream side, or will a log come down and plug it? So not just a 25-year storm, but something like that combined with a blockage. I believe it's within 24 hours, right, that this can build up and overtop. So.
I'm sorry,
and
can
it's
you
a
introduce
difficult-
yourself? This
Oh,
is
sorry,
for the record.
I'm Ty Johnson with HCR Engineering.
Okay, thank you.
So that was kind of fast, but so if I just boil it down, if the culvert were to get blocked in a high 25 or 100-year flood event, you're saying it would be less than 24 hours for that whole canyon to fill behind it?
Yeah,
For those homes that are immediately behind the culvert?
I believe that's.
That's what you said, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you for the clarification. Moving on to the community impacts. So we've talked about the environmental impacts a bit, and now I want to move into this side. So with this, we looked at impacts not only to emergency services, but the utilities as well, and how it affects the neighborhood itself. And I'll touch briefly on the stakeholder support or stakeholder feedback that we've received. So moving to the emergency services, the McLean Black Lake Fire District does provide emergency services to this area, and primarily dispatch from their station number 91 on Delphi Road, which is about 5 miles away from where the culvert currently is. We looked at the response times that we would expect with the road abandonment. We looked at the response times that they currently provide. And then we also, from the fire district, found that the National Fire Protection Association standard response time is within 6 minutes. However, they said that that standard is met only about 10% of the time, really due to low staffing issues. So when we look at the response time from their primary station, station number 91, closing the road would increase response time for only those homes west of the creek. So if the primary route for the response is going up Cooper Point Road, typically the fire department or fire trucks would cut through on Country Club Road to access the west side of the creek. Should the road no longer be there, they would have to take a different route there. So the 69 homes on the west side of the creek would be those that would be most affected by an increase in response time. That increase would range from about 0 minutes on one end of the 69 homes to adding about 3 minutes for the furthest away. What that would mean is the response time would be about a total of 13 minutes for the most remote homes. Putting that in perspective, other areas that the fire district serves, for example, the north end of Summit Lake, that response time is about 13 to 14 minutes. The north end of Cooper Point Road is about 11 and a half minutes. And again, the longest response time, should the road be removed, is about 13 minutes at Green Cove Creek on the west side of the creek. When we look at the other options beside the road abandonment, there is a slight increase in response time should the pedestrian bridge with fire access be installed. And by slight, I mean a minute or less. And with the other two options, the open bottom culvert and the 2-lane road bridge, there'd be no change to response time, because effectively we remain with a 2-lane road right there. Commissioner Mather, did you have a question? You had that?
No? I'm good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So when we look at, we just talked about the change in response time, and now I think it's good to put in perspective how many calls the fire district gets, and I'm really gonna focus on those 69 homes that would be affected by the road abandonment. So over the last 4.5 years, those 69 homes, the fire district received 27 calls from those 69 homes. That's an average of about 6 calls per year. And again, the delay in response time would be about 3 minutes, or up to 3 minutes for the homes furthest away from the fire district. So of those 27 calls, 5 were advanced life support, 18 were basic life support, and 4 were fire calls. Those calls on those homes on the west side represent about just under 3% of the total call volume the fire district received in that same period. So moving on to the utility side, that community is served by water, power, gas, and phone. When we look at the power, gas, and phone, those are much more, much easier to relocate or reroute. But when we look at the PUD's water service area, that is a much bigger challenge to provide water, continue to provide water on the west side of the creek. The gas can be rerouted, the power and phone can go overhead or go a different direction. In fact, PSE Gas has already decided to relocate along Biscay Drive. When we look at the four options we considered, certainly removing the road has the biggest challenge for the water district. Right now, the PUD has a water main within the existing road embankment. So again, were the road embankment removed, they would certainly have to take a different route. Any one of the other three options, the two bridges, the PUD can actually strap the water line to the bottom of that bridge. That happens all the time with utilities. It would be not an unusual thing, and the cost is significantly cheaper for the PUD. So a little background on the PUD. It has this water system has just over 100 customers. Most are on the west side of the creek, and their well and reservoirs. They have two 30,000-gallon reservoirs on the east side of the creek. And the challenge with the water system is if we sever the one pipe that serves those 65 homes, there's no valve the PUD can turn off on one side and turn on the other side to reroute water from another pipe. Simply because there is no other pipe. There's one pipe that serves that community. And were the road removed and the water line removed, we would have 65 homes with no water service. I mentioned a fairly straightforward way to get water across that canyon is to attach it to the bridge. If the road was abandoned, the PUD would, they discussed a few different options. One would be boring a water line under the ravine and back up on the other side. That has some very significant technical challenges. It'd be very costly. And at this point, I don't know if they've done the research enough to know how even feasible that would be, but certainly the cost would be extraordinary. They also looked at installing a new well on the west side of the creek. Aside from the uncertainty of finding good potable water, the time frame to plan that, permit that, and get it reviewed by the state, design the upgrades to the infrastructure needed, it's highly unlikely that that could be done by 2024. And certainly, that would be another expensive proposition for the PUD. Because it's a PUD, and again, this is the PUD's cost, not the county's cost, but the increase to the PUD rates, from information from the PUD would suggested that the rates would increase about 26% for their just over 7,000 customers across the county.
And just, I mean,
Yeah.
I think I know the answer to this, but I just want to hear it. Like, legally speaking, we have the right to do this. Like, if PUD is kind of stuck, they don't, I don't know what kind of a franchise agreement or contract we have, but
Correct.
it sounds like we could do this if we thought it was the right thing overall, and they would have to bear the result of that.
Correct.
Okay.
So moving on to the neighborhood connectivity, I mentioned there's 69 homes on the west side, 46 on the east side. That's just in this small community. There's other homes up on Sunset Beach Drive, on Biscay Drive, that typically don't use this section of road. The daily traffic on Country Club Road in the location of the culvert is just under 300 vehicles per day. And I really want to emphasize too on this, all four of these options that we've looked at, road access will be open to every home in all of these options. None of these options will change the inability for folks to get to their homes. So I think that's a concern we heard at some point in earlier this year that we'd be cutting off access to homes. In some cases, we might be changing the access, but at no point will homes be landlocked. When we look at the, certainly the 2-lane road bridge or the big open bottom culvert, there'd be no change to commuting patterns once construction was complete. People could continue to drive on Country Club Road. If the road was abandoned, certainly commutes would increase for some of those homes. The increase would be about 1.3 miles each way, adds about 4 minutes for those homes closest to the creek. What that would mean is the time and distance to go from just the west side of the creek to the intersection of Cooper Point and 36th now takes about 2 minutes. And if the road is abandoned, it would take about 6 minutes. So, as you've probably been able to tell, it's
Can I ask one more question, Scott?
Oh, of course.
This kind of goes back to, before we get into this chart, the culvert idea. Is there something about this culvert that's gonna make it stronger or less likely to fail? Because you're making an even bigger culvert and you're putting, all that dirt back on top of it. How do we know this will it last longer, or do we have new technology to make it better?
It will likely last longer. Culverts, the bridges would be designed to have about a 75-year life. Culverts typically are about a 50-year life. So when we look at the culvert that was out there, it was probably nearing the end of its life. We've got some culverts that last a lot longer. Some culverts that don't last as long, which is part of the reason we do regular inspections on these culverts, which, as we did on this one in April 2019, it appeared fine. But since then, it collapsed. So at some point, everything we build will have to be replaced.
So it wasn't necessarily that culvert was deficient or anything, it might have just been its normal lifespan.
During the end of its life, yeah.
Okay,
Scott, I know we have a couple more slides left, but I just want to make sure that we go through them quickly, just because I want to make sure that we have enough time for questions towards the end.
Oh, you bet. I will
Thank you.
make sure we do that. So, certainly the stakeholder support is this project, regardless of the alternative chosen, would have different levels of support depending on what we have. And very few projects have 100% support from all parties. And this is certainly one of those. And I've talked a little bit about the impact this would have. It would have a different impact on emergency services, different impact on the PUD, depending on what access or what ended up going in there. And again, I mentioned before, we looked at both the cost to the county and the cost to the PUD, which is the primary other stakeholder that would have a financial stake in this. And certainly, the cost for all of these are expensive. We included cost, I think appropriately looking at contingency, we looked at inflation. One of the big caveats in here is, as you're aware, inflation has been rampant in construction and really everything over the last year or so. I don't know when that will slow down, but certainly these are planning level numbers that are certainly subject to change. It's very hard to forecast 1 to 2 years out at this point because costs have changed so much. And so looking at a path forward, we did look at all 4 of these considerations, and it's important to recognize that there's no wrong path forward. They're all legal. For the most part, they're all constructible by 2024. The one the large open bottom culvert might be challenging technically, but it could likely be built, but the other 3 could certainly be built. Each of them has its own advantages and disadvantages. Each has a different impact on different stakeholders, and certainly different levels of support from different parts of the community. One of the areas that we also looked at is what's the future going to bring? We do expect this area to have a lot of growth, just like the whole county, and trying to plan for a transportation system that provides a robust road network for that growth can be challenging. And we're looking into our crystal ball to figure out or to estimate what that might be and the best way to serve all those folks that will be coming. So all that said, we looked at all those different considerations and believed that the 2-lane road bridge, although very expensive, is the best to serve our community. It provides, really, as I mentioned, a good transportation system for current folks and the future growth. Provides that emergency access, especially in the event of Biscay Street is closed. Least impact to emergency response and public safety. Meets fish passage, provides neighborhood connectivity, and a significant restoration of the section of the stream corridor.
Do you have any sense of, like, when you're talking about the chart with the costs, and, oh, you wrote a bin and 3.8 to 4.9, but then the PUD has to deal with the water main, and you put that in terms of percentage increase to the ratepayers, but
Yeah.
let's say the county was gonna pay that, to look at the total aggregate cost, do we know what that construction or
Yeah, that's the
project
goal.
cost for that kind of whatever they'd have to do to fix their problem?
So you're looking at the slide with the community, yeah. So that community cost is really just adding the county and the PUD cost. So
Oh, it is, okay.
It is, yeah.
Okay, all right, thank you.
And then finally, the funding strategy. I think this certainly is a key part of this whole discussion. And I think it's important to recognize that we do have a commitment to do something out there. Public Works has been very proactive in looking for grants. We've applied for one for design, because that was the only information we could really apply for. We don't have a path forward yet. We'll be applying for about $5 million of grants in the next 2 months. We don't know what how competitive those grants will be. We expect to be very competitive. But we're going to continue to scour every resource we have to look for more grants, certainly. And then we're also looking at Public Works Trust Fund loan and county funds as well. And with that, I suspect there'll be a few questions and some discussion coming up, so I'll open it up for that.
Thank you, Scott. Okay, I know I have a couple of questions, but Commissioner Menzer, go ahead.
No, I've been taking questions all on the way, Madam Chair, go ahead.
Okay. So my first question is in terms of the permit, right? We've been talking about trying to meet the deadline, and is there a possibility of an extension, right, as we try to find more funding?
I'll let Trevin speak to that, but I think it's also important to just emphasize too that the longer that temporary pipe stays in place, the longer the current conditions remain, which does pose some challenges for looking at the road and utilities and access. But I'll kick it to Trevin about the logistics of that and how that would work.
Sure. So Trevin Taylor, Senior Environmental Coordinator for Public Works. So basically the permit is an extension. The extension basically going to appeal process is what it really be in the situation here. So what I want to, before we start talking about extension, I want to talk a little bit about the biology issue we have going on out there with the chum run in particular. We got coho, we got several different species of salmon. And one reason that we're on this 3-year fix is the idea is you don't want to lose a full cycle of fish. You know, the idea is that, you know, everybody kind of knows that salmon are on a 4-year schedule. They go out, they come back. It's been limited in there for quite a while, although even though the old culvert was designated a full blockage before the repair, there were situations where species were able to take advantage in the right water conditions, right time of year upstream. So on just the biology point of view, we really don't want to miss any more time because then you're going to lose this full cycle of even the fish that were able to get upstream before the repair. So the next part, if we were not able to meet the 2024, we would go into basically an appeal process with WFW. There's a series of RCWs and WACs that we kind of follow through. It goes into basically, there's 2 different versions of it. You kind of work your way through the mitigation process, which could lead to basically civil or criminal penalties. I don't expect the county to put itself in a position for a criminal penalty here, but it does go that route. It works into fines. So the fines are topped out at $10,000, and it's hard to tell from the WAC if it's actually per incident or how it actually keeps going, if it keeps going or if it's topped out. So even if we went through the appeal process, the mitigation to leave that in place would probably exceed the cost of the project by the time you're done. The other part is that really sets the table for other agencies to come in, and the liability of the county's hanging out there. I mean, DOT, when the state lost the Culvert case, really kind of set the table for this scenario. And there's no doubt that we can't deny that the culvert was already past its age, that it was already in a position to be replaced, needed to be brought up to current standards, and the emergency repair to fix the road has made the biology side of it a worse condition. I think we gotta be honest about that. That's just the scenario there. So now, what's a little bit upside down with this versus my normal, when you guys hear me talk about fish passage and stuff, this really is a road repair project that has a major fish component to it. So that's a little bit different than normally when I come in and talk to you, we're talking about a kind of a fish first approach. This really is, what is the right alternative for this location? What is the right thing that's gonna work, not only for the community, but also for the biology side of it when you're done, do the expense. I mean, there's things like, once again, it's terrestrial species going up and down, the amount of gravel and material to allow the stream to fully function again. I know the opening seems sticker shock wise, went from 5 foot to 50, but it's really been 50 years of trapping material upstream. There's an 8-foot difference just in the stream bed alone that's gonna be part of this to make it fully function. So, in the biology habitat side of the house, it's just time to kind of bring it up to current standards and allow it to be a stream again, at least up to the next segment. So.
Maybe a follow-up to that, Madam Chair. I understand what you stated in terms of the potential civil and criminal cases if the county leaves the current conditions untouched. I think the question was, is there an opportunity to extend? Not only that perhaps we are working on a long-term solution. Is there an option to really work with the state to extend the deadline? I think that was the question, as opposed to just leaving the conditions as is.
I believe that extension would be in the form of that appeal and negotiating the mitigation to avoid penalty is really where it would go. Because we're out of compliance after the deadline in 24. So that's where we'd open back up. So yes, there's the process to appeal it, which would then by default act as an extension. WFW most likely is not gonna just grant us a regular extension like on a regular project that I have to where there's not a whole lot to take. It would be, this is much different because we know that we've made the situation, compounded the situation with the temporary repair.
I think Scott's point at the front end kind of answered that, because he was saying that this isn't just a deadline that's arbitrary. There's like reasons for it because the conditions aren't safe for the upstream homes, for the road. So, I mean, even if you could just fill out a form and get an extension, that might not be the right thing for us to do, given the conditions that we have to contend
I
with.
appreciate that, Commissioner.
I asked it, was because 2024 is not that far away. And I understand this is a priority for, the commission as well as staff, as well as our different partners. But I just want us to be realistic, and there's so many supply chain issues going on right now. That's just one aspect of things. The other aspect is construction costs. And so we might be working on a solution, but I just want us to be realistic. Are we going to be able to be done by 2024?
You said you thought they were all constructible other than maybe the culvert by 2024.
Right, and some of that hinges on, certainly when we start the process for design. There's ways that we've been talking about how we can accelerate or avoid or minimize the supply chain issues by ordering materials ahead of time. Can't always do that with everything. A lot of it will depend on really what option is chosen. Because what we have is a short, it's a long bridge, a relatively short linear project, but it is really a bridge which has a limited number of components. There's not a lot of asphalt. There's not going to be a lot of plastic. Computer chips aren't going to be an issue. It's, a lot of concrete, dirt, and trucking. That's really what it will get down to. There'll be some lights, possibly some lighting installed, depending on, again, what gets chosen and how that final design works out.
What will guarantee that we won't make the deadline is if the commission jerks around and we chew on this for 6 more months and don't make a decision about what we're doing. So that's my concern.
And maybe a follow-up, I'm not arguing the technical requirements, environmental requirements. And I think it's pretty well laid out in terms of the impacts to the environment, to the community, and to the response times. But there is a gap in funding. And how the board is going to be authorizing a project to move forward without having a financial strategy behind it. And that is a big concern. And I think we as a staff, we have the obligation to bring a solid financial strategy for the board to weigh in. Because I don't think the board is in the position to say, go ahead with this project without knowing how we're going to be paid for it. So I just want to make sure that, and that is probably the question of the extension. I'm not arguing the validity of this project whatsoever. I think it was very clear from the technical point of view, the environmental point of view, and from the safety point of view. How we're going to be able to fund this is really the next question that perhaps we as a staff, we need to bring to the board.
So talking about the financial aspects of things, that is my next question, right? We just went through a process where we had to amend several projects because of the increased cost of construction. So I'm wondering if that's been, we usually allow the 10% wiggle room, but is there an estimate that this might go higher, right? Just because of the tight deadlines that we have in the future. Has that been considered at all?
We did account for inflation over the next 2 years. I think we accounted for 8.5% inflation each year for the next 2 years. That's higher than it has historically been, not as high as it has been lately. So I think trying to look into the crystal ball, I think we did kind of an appropriate look ahead. But at this point, until we get the design refined a bit more, or whichever option we go down, until we get that narrowed down a bit more, it'll be pretty hard to narrow that, to tighten that range much more at this point.
Can I answer that?
Oh, please do.
Yeah, so along with the inflation, costs that were added, we've also added a planning level contingency into our estimate also. For 15%, we added a 25% contingency, just to ensure, as the industry is continuing to change and construction costs are going up, just to make sure that as we move forward in the future that, we're going to be closer to what those costs actually may be.
Yeah.
And the 8.8 is inclusive of design, permitting, and construction. That's correct.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. I guess, from my point of view on things, I definitely would like to see a financial strategy behind it, right? Seeing how we're going to pay for all of this. I appreciate that staff has been proactive in trying to get grants for this, because I know it's a huge project. I am supportive of the recommendation that staff has provided. I understand the price tag is quite a bit high, but I think that just puts us in a position of being really good partners. And I appreciate the outreach that staff have done to our different partners and how they would be affected. It is very informative. I also did drive through that area just because I kind of wanted to see what, when residents were talking to me about it, I wanted to see what specifically they were talking about. I wanted to see the routes. And so that also helped inform my decision. So that's kind of just laying out kind of where I stand. I know we're not making a decision today. There are next steps to it, and I see the county manager raised his hand.
Maybe I can propose next steps, and maybe I can work with you, Scott, and your director. I think we need to explore the road fund This is, as Trevin stated, this is a road project. It has a fish barrier component. Also, we need to explore the stormwater fee. I think you highlighted that in a couple of meetings ago. There really is a stormwater component. We need to explore the stormwater utility, how it can help us mitigate this funding. And also, perhaps there's a great opportunity to reroute the $2 the board set aside for fish barrier passage. Because I understand the different fish barrier projects that we have in place, but I think this is an emergency, and I think we need to find a way as to how we can probably fund this particular project. So I believe that is probably the next step, if I may, and how quickly we can bring back this financial model is essential.
Excellent.
Commissioner Menser?
Yeah, I mean, that sounds like the right approach. I appreciate the presentation. I think you guys have really, brought all the information we needed and answered some of my questions and trying to balance, giving us a good summation of where all the different considerations are. I think I support what Commissioner McGee said, but in terms of supporting the preferred recommendation that you're bringing forward, but I am very sensitive to the time element here, and we cannot financially make that option work. Then I think we've got to find an option that will work. But sure, I'm hoping that we can be creative and find an option that, because it seems like that's the one that pluses across the chart. So let's see if we can make it happen.
Great, excellent. Thank you.
Okay, so it is 9:56 a.m. So I'm imagining there will be a follow-up with some financial strategies to see if that recommendation can be an option. And then if not, like Commissioner Menster said, we have to start looking at other options if the financials don't cut out. So 9:56 a.m. We are adjourned.